for those communities, when their members are told that you have to pay taxes and that some of those taxes are going to be used to pay for something that goes against your sort of just personal values, but your faith community's sort of official teachings, right? What does that mean?
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore how religion is lived. I'm your host, Elaine Howard Eklund. I'm a sociologist, and I also have the privilege of directing the Banyak Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance at Rice University. Today, we're going to talk about taxes. Yes, you heard me right, taxes. But more specifically, how both religious and non-religious Americans in the U.S. think about paying their taxes and how that has implications for larger society and really the kind of moral communities that we're part of. Our guest is someone I've known for a while that I've had the privilege of knowing, Ruth Braunstein. Ruth is a sociologist at Johns Hopkins University, where she studies religion, politics, and money, all the controversial things. She is most recently the author of My Tax Dollars: The Morality of Taxpaying in America. And she is the producer and host of the audio documentary When the Wolves Came, Evangelicals Resisting Extremism. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, you should. She writes frequently for public audiences, including at her Substack newsletter, Democracy is Hard. Thank you for joining us, Ruthie. It's so good to have you on Religion Unmuted.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I have to say that when I first started reading your book, My Tax Dollars, I was not convinced, right? When you see the title, you're kind of like, how can this possibly be about moral communities or religion or even really be relevant? And I have to say, you're such a fine writer that after the first chapter, I was totally hooked. And it was one of those books that I just read right through. Only you could make paying taxes scintillating. So that's like the highest compliment I think I can give.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. No, I mean it. So you have studied so many things, and just tell our listeners a little bit about how you got interested in studying taxation.
Sure. So, it seems maybe like a strange choice for a sociologist of religion. You know, I study religion and politics, but I do spend a lot of time studying religion to suddenly take on taxation as a topic. But, you know, what I really got interested in some previous projects was how passionately people did talk about taxes and how, you know, sort of shot through with morality and these moral questions those conversations were. And I discovered that first in field work I was doing with the Tea Party movement, which was a conservative right-wing movement that emerged in the early 2000s. And, you know, the way that they talked about taxation drew on some very clear kind of moral discourses about taxation as theft and really comparing taxation directly to other forms of religious giving, like tithing. And so that got me interested. And then soon after I decided I wanted to really dig into that further, I discovered another group of religious folks, many religious, anti-war tax resistors who also brought a lot of their religious ideas kind of into their thinking about tax paying. And those kind of two groups really got me started thinking about this and helped me to see that religious communities in the U.S. in particular have a lot to say about taxation.
Yeah.
Those discourses make their way into our mainstream debates, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, and I want to give you a chance to delve into that just a little bit more. So the topic of this podcast is how religion is lived. And so how did you see religion lived through the kinds of moral frameworks or the ways that people talked about taxes?
So one of the things that struck me, and it might sound surprising that this was like a finding about a book on taxation, is that for a lot of people, taxes are about money. Now, of course, they're about money, but in the way that we sometimes think about taxes as being about politics and policy and a proxy for our views of government. But for many people in their like lived experiences of thinking about and paying their taxes, they're thinking about it alongside other kinds of money and monetary giving that don't have those same clear ideological kind of meanings attached to them. And, for people who study religious community, money is a really big part of how people live their values. And we think about that most directly in the form of religious giving, right? How much money we might directly contribute to our faith communities, but also in terms of teachings about how we should spend our money and the values attached to our roles as consumers, whether there's some kinds of spending that are allowed or disallowed or frowned upon and salutary, or about how we earn our money, right? Whether, the places that we go and work and the ways that we're actually earning money have kind of moral and religious meaning attached to them. So money really is a big part of how people are working out what it looks like to be a pious member of their faith community and practice. And what I found was that people think about their tax dollars as a kind of parallel form of money that carries those same implications for them.
Yeah, no, I totally am convinced by your argument, and I'm trying to put it together with, as you know, because you've read some of my work as well, that my colleague Denise Daniels and I just finished a book on faith in the workplace. And it was funny, we found that people who worked in occupations that were close to money, like in accounting or in business broadly, had a hard time seeing those as sacred occupations, as having the ability to serve God through those occupations. Whereas people who worked with people or in service occupations, it was super easy for them to see like, oh, this is a sacred occupation. Yet I'm totally buying what you're saying about money itself and the way we think about money being a very sacred, a very moral act. And how do you put all that stuff together? It's like we're just inconsistent. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think as sociologists, we know that we are inconsistent and that a lot of what people are doing is trying to kind of make sense of those inconsistencies and, be intentional to some degree about how they are living in this really complex, interconnected capitalist world. And that was a backdrop that I found that so many of the people that I ended up talking to were grappling with. And so, right, our money, even if we never leave our town that we live in, our money does. Our money is like this kind of tentacle that we put out into the world that can reach faraway places and conflicts and kind of what we may view as morally complicated kind of places in the world and situations in the world, and our money implicates us in those. And it can be a source of healing for those places, right? When people send monetary donations around the world to help something, or it can be a source of kind of entanglement for us, where we begin to feel that maybe we're complicit in kind of atrocities that are happening halfway around the world. And so, right, money can sort of connect us to those things. And so when we think about it that way, money isn't kind of like good or bad, right? Money is this sort of extension of our own moral selves. So there's that piece of it. But then there's also the backdrop that many people do think of money as a kind of corrupting tool, right? Money is this like profane object that corrupts relationships or corrupts, our own morality. And this is, sometimes taught just in our culture and sometimes taught in our individual faith traditions. And so then the work becomes, how do we transform that corrupting sort of profane object into something sacred through our effort, but like its natural state is one of corruption. And so we do have these rival understandings, but in both cases, it requires us to think about what is our role in using money in a way that if it's neutral, sending it more toward that moral side, or if it's intrinsically corrupt, right, kind of sacralizing it in a way.
Yeah, to our listeners, nerd alert here. So you and I are both students of Emile Durkheim, right?
Indeed.
Famous and perhaps infamous early French sociologist who pioneered some ideas about the sacred and the profane. So you're kind of talking about it already, but do you want to say more about the conditions under which money is viewed very sacred and the conditions under which it's viewed very profanely?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, going back to Durkheim, and this has really become kind of a fundamental premise of people who study culture and religion within our field of sociology. Essentially, we believe that people are making meaning in the world by dividing things into kind of those things that are sacred, meaning sort of special, set apart, in need of protection, often by the community, as well as kind of reverence. And those things that are profane. And the profane for Durkheim actually ends up blending two different things that get disaggregated later. And it's the kind of everyday, right, kind of not particularly morally salient parts of our lives, like doing the dishes. And then there's the profane, which is really morally charged, but charged in a negative way and viewed as a threat to that special sacred thing. And so, we can think about how in the course of our politics, certain actors and people can get kind of set apart as like sacred, special, morally worthy, and other kinds of practices can be viewed as profane threats to those sacred things. And this in sort of modern American culture, when we think about what are the sacred goods that actually unite us across maybe specific religious traditions, right? We can think of things like the individual and human dignity, right, as a sort of shared understanding of what is sacred. And so threats to that, like murder, are
Yeah,
viewed
that's right.
as deeply profane,
That's
right?
right.
We can think of children, particularly the kind of innocence of children that are like in need of protection. So anything that threatens children is viewed as profane. And so there's not that many things that actually we do have sort of a shared vision of what is sacred. For some people, the nation might rise to that level, or the political community itself. And so threats to that can be viewed as profane. And then, of course, within every religious tradition, there's sort of smaller scale versions of what people set aside as sacred and view as profane as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I want to give you a chance just to talk about your podcast too, and if there's a way you relate these two projects, the very successful When the Wolves Came podcast, and then this book on taxation, or just you want to talk about the podcast, it's not related at all, that's fine with me too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, I think, the through line for both of these, and it's a good segue from the thinking about the sacred versus profane question, is, what is it that it means to live in a diverse and disagreeing
That's
political
right.
community, right? And this is the main question that you and your center think about too, right? That at the end of the day, we all live on this shared patch of earth, and we're really different. And we're different in terms of what we look like and what we feel and our values and our faith and our work, right? All of those things are really different. And so the question is, how do we figure out how to live together? And in the case of taxes, it's a real material test
Yep.
of our ability to live together. Can we devise a system where we each give up a little bit of something in order to create stability and structures that we benefit from directly and indirectly, and also provides a sense of sort of community that we can all rely on? And in the case of the podcast, I'm looking at sort of challenges to that sense of community and kind of real big questions that people are asking about, can we actually live together as diverse and disagreeing people? And what are some of the kinds of emergent ideologies that challenge that? And who are the people who are maybe trying to really defend this principle of pluralism might be the best thing for all of us?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And are new episodes of the podcast coming out, or was that a one-time?
It is. The season that we created is all out.
Okay.
We are thinking about whether, there might be the ability to make another season. And so stay tuned.
So if someone wanted to come to you with funding to make another season, you wouldn't be opposed to that idea?
We would not be opposed to that idea. Yeah, it
It's
does.
really good. It's really good. So I just want to put a plug out there for you.
Thank you.
So tell us, if you would, or feel comfortable, about your own religious identity. I always ask folks on the podcast this, and how has your own religious identity had an impact on the work you do as a sociologist or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. I was raised in an interfaith family of Jews and Catholics. And raised in the Reform Jewish tradition, but with kind of connections through family to the Catholic faith, and we celebrated all the holidays and, sort of were exposed to both traditions. And I was also raised in the South in Georgia, and went to Christian schools for most of my life growing up. And so spent a lot of time sort of exposed to Protestant Christianity as well. And I think that, in addition to all the other kinds of interesting things about being raised with a foot in lots of different traditions, is that I think it prepared me really well to do this kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where, I like to think about it as like, I'm not truly an insider or an outsider in any of the sort of faith communities that I study. And that gives me some tools to kind of get my bearings in those spaces, and also the ability to ask questions without people being like, well, you know how it is, right? People actually will answer those questions. And, I really feel like there's something that I gained from exposure to all of those traditions, and that they all sort of have things to add to our understanding of what it means to be a good person and a good citizen in this country.
Yeah, you're the perfect person for us to interview, right? You're just perfect for our work at the Banyek Institute. So when you think about the future and your own hopes as a scholar and really as a leader in civic spaces, what are your hopes? How do you approach faith maybe in the way you think about leadership and research?
Yeah, it's an interesting time. And I think that over the past, 10 or 15 years that I've been doing this work, my thinking about that has really changed. And it's in part because the topics that we are studying have become really central to some of the most significant and I think precarious kinds of conversations that we're having as a country, and about what it means to be a pluralistic democracy.
That's right.
And so, I think that earlier in my career, I was very focused on doing good, solid research and sharing those with my colleagues in order to advance kind of our internal understanding of these issues. And, as these debates have become much more kind of public, I've really turned outward more, and I'm trying to have more conversations with folks who are not scholars, but who are thinking in some cases really deeply about the questions that we think about as scholars. And so what does it look like to kind of translate what we're doing into terms that non-scholars understand, and how to also learn from non-scholars, what I think of as kind of like morally articulate people in the world that are thinking about these things really deeply. We may not agree with them, but they have developed really robust vocabularies for understanding issues like taxes or democracy or what it means to be a Christian in public life, and really listening to those folks and learning from them as well.
Do you have any advice? I know that there's a lot of academics who would like to be like you, have the kind of voice that you have in the broader public sphere. For those who want to work hard to really translate our work to broader audience, do you have just a couple of points of advice for us?
I mean, I'm not sure that I'm doing it perfectly, or even right. A lot of it is just about sort of taking some chances about those broader conversations. And I think doing it, I look at you're a person who has a lot of these conversations as well. And I think that it only works if we can also be really rigorous in our scholarly work, so that is really solid. And so not taking chances on that, right? But then taking chances in terms of having conversations that are sometimes messy or sometimes risky with people outside of comfortable spaces, and being kind of a person in those spaces as well as a scholar, and then also being really clear about how those two things connect to each other. One of the things I talk about with my students a lot is that, the idea of objectivity comes up a lot when we're talking about our research, and there's really specific methods that we use to be rigorous in asking our questions and even-handed in how we treat a lot of topics. But at the end of the day, we're also people, and we bring our own backgrounds and questions into our work. And so being really transparent about that is the best way that we can give our readers a chance to kind of evaluate where our blind spots are and what we might be missing. And so a lot of the debates we're having in public are also about how to trust science. And I think being clearer about what it means to be a scientist in the world that is also a person and how to evaluate our work is another piece of what I think we could be doing more.
I really like that. So I think I hadn't thought about it quite that way before, that you think there are certain first principles we have as scholars and places we shouldn't take risks. So we shouldn't take risks with the rigor of our scholarship. We want to keep to these kind of first principles as scholars, but we can take risks when it comes to trying to get out there and relating to people that we might not feel comfortable with or that might not fully understand us, for the sake of trying to learn from folks that could benefit from knowing more about our scholarship and that we could benefit from knowing more about their perspectives.
Yeah. And I'm kind of feeling my way through that.
Yeah. Boy, I
Getting
hear you.
better.
I hear you, friend. I hear you.
Yeah.
So what's your next project? Yeah. What do you want to pitch to us?
Yeah. Well, I think that it seems strange at the end of writing a book that took about 10 years to write to say that I'm not done with that project yet. But part of the process of writing this book was doing really in-depth studies of 3 different activist communities. One, as I mentioned, kind of more right-wing anti-government activists who raise questions about the legitimacy of taxation as a system. One, anti-war activists who are concerned about the use of their dollars to fund war, particularly if they identify as conscientiously opposed to war in general. And then the third is anti-abortion activists who are similarly concerned about the use of their dollars in order to fund abortion, which they view as something that is conscientiously sort of evil or sinful for them. And so I have a lot of material that got left on the cutting room floor that I'm looking to write more about each of those communities. And in each way, religion is really a central part of how people come to understand what it means to have money and to control the uses of that money. It is a big part of how they pitch their right to have some say over how that money is used, whether having to do with religious freedom or the freedom of conscience. And it often is a big part of their organizational base and how people come to understand, what is a good or a bad use of their money. And so, these are all questions that I'm looking forward to kind of digging into further in the coming year.
I'd love to see more. Yeah, it's, again, you so surprised me with this book. I love to see more of this. I don't think I've asked you yet how religious pluralism and religious conflict came up in your work.
Yeah, well, it's a really tough question where taxes are involved. And so I'll just give you the example because it's clearest in the case of anti-war and anti-abortion activists, where there are faith communities in the United States that, take a particular position on, for example, war or abortion, respectively. And for those communities, when their members are told that you have to pay taxes and that some of those taxes are going to be used to pay for something that goes against your sort of just personal values, but your faith community's sort of official teachings, right? What does that mean for you? And what does that mean for the faith communities as a whole? And so in the case of the Catholic Church and for many evangelical Christians who are against abortion, their communities really rallied, particularly in the 1970s, after Roe v. Wade made abortion legal, to say that this places an undue burden on our people, right? That as individuals, they should not be asked to do this. And lawmakers actually agreed and said, you're right, let's put some sort of provisions in our budget. The most sort of well-known one is the Hyde Amendment that says that no tax dollars or federal monies will be used to directly fund abortion, in that case through Medicaid. And that was viewed as a kind of victory for religious freedom. At the same time, there are increasingly faith groups that are articulating that for them, it's actually important that their tax dollars be used to support reproductive health care. And Jews have been sort of the organized front of that effort. And so what do you do when faith communities have conflicting values? And it's not just about policies per se, but about how individuals' tax dollars will be used or not used to advance those policies. Because once it's our money, and the reason the title of the book is My Tax Dollars, is that Americans really do understand tax dollars as their dollars. That even after they are taxed and they are all put into one big pot in the U.S. Treasury, they are still their dollars floating around in that pot. And they bear some moral responsibility for how they are spent. And so, right, that's a real case where we have to think about, what does it mean to all live together? Are there exemptions? Are there, do we say, okay, we're not going to spend money on anything that's morally complicated? Well, that's impossible. And so how do we work this out? And, one of the things that I call for in the book is actually more conversations about this and like kind of more awareness by lawmakers that they're not just making decisions about kind of dollars and cents. They really are making decisions about kind of whose vision of the sacred is going to be prioritized in our conversations about the budget, and that having more moral fluency to kind of speak in those terms, I think would go a long way to make ordinary citizens feel more heard.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just so supportive of what you're doing and what you're saying. We consistently see policymakers and politicians just under-prepare in terms of their knowledge of religion and the kind of moral constructs that shape people's lives. Sometimes I end by saying, when you think about your work and your life, and this is all still evolving, I know, anything else you want to share with our listeners?
That's such a good question. Yeah, I think that one of the big themes that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about right now is what it means to live in a pluralistic democracy, and why we should value democracy as the best solution to pluralism. Because we sometimes just sort of crash those two ideas together without actually thinking through why democracy is best. And I actually think that we're in a moment where we have to explain it. We have to actually make a case for why democracy is better. And the way that, lots of people think about this, and I borrow from them, has to do with this idea that we kind of have three choices when different groups of people are trying to live together. One is that we kill each other, which is not my preference. The second is that one group takes control and dominates all of the other groups, largely through force. And the other option is that we figure out how to live together. And that third option is really hard, right? I think we sometimes have a kumbaya vision of democracy, as if we're just going to all come together and talk through our differences and find a solution that works for everyone. But no, that's not how this works. There's often scarce resources. There's often trade-offs. There's often, really hard conversations and conflict. And I increasingly think we need to get better at dealing with conflict and having a comfort level with it, and also not making our entire lives and relationships about that conflict.
That's right.
And so, right, how do we go and fight the good fight for what we believe in, and then still treat the people on the other side of those arguments as our neighbors at the end of the day, and normalize that? And how do we come to see that sort of constant fighting is actually better than every other alternative?
Yeah.
That no one ever said this was going to be easy, but I do think that it's the best way we can all kind of optimize our own flourishing.
That's right.
Yeah. That for me is a project. I'm raised Southern. I'm a pleaser. I like to avoid disagreement, but right, how do we do this? How do we get better at this kind of, civil disagreement?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Civil disagreement. We need to have this kind of engaged, convicted, civil disagreement for the common good. It's really it's a tall order, isn't it? Well, you're doing it. You're helping us lead the way. So proud of you and the work that you're doing. Thanks for all you've given to our guild and to the broader public. And how can our listeners go and find out more about your work? Where can they go to find out about you?
Well, thanks so much. And I'm really grateful for everything you're doing as well. I know that producing something like this, is, which is one of many things you do, is a lot to do. So yeah, you can find me on Substack at Democracy is Hard. You can see a theme there because democracy is hard. And you can find my book at My Tax Dollars, The Morality of Taxpaying in America. And you can find my podcast, When the Wolves Came, Evangelicals Against Extremism, anywhere you get your podcasts. And so, yeah, join the conversation.
Yeah, thank you again. Thank you. And speaking of podcasts, that's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, and even if you didn't, make sure to subscribe to, rate us, and review us wherever you listen. It's super important, folks, that you go ahead and do that. Subscribe, rate, and review. And my special thanks to our guest, Ruth Braunstein. Today's show was written by myself and Haley Hemstreet. Our series is produced by Three Wire Creative. Religion Unmuted is a joint venture of the Boniek Institute and the Religion and Public Life Center at Rice University. I'm Elaine Howard Eklund. Until next time.